What our government and people want is peace and security in the Far East.
Yoshiko Kawashima is most well known for their career in espionage, military exploits in Manchuria, and becoming a sort of androgynous propaganda symbol for the Japanese army during the Second World War. Yoshiko is probably one of the most interesting figures I've encountered in East Asian history, but not necessarily because of their military career. Actually, what I find most interesting about Yoshiko's story is how other historians attempt to characterize them. You see, Yoshiko was a complicated individual with oftentimes clashing allegiances. So while I was doing the research for this video, I came across historians and old documents trying to categorize Yoshiko and try to put them into this certain box or label. For example, the Chinese nationalists deemed Yoshiko to be a traitor to the Chinese. On the other hand, the Japanese portrayed them as this inspiring and romantic liberator figure. In the West, Yoshiko was nicknamed the Joan of Arc of the East, or the Eastern Mata Hari. Furthermore, Yoshiko's gender identity is also contested amongst historians. Some label Yoshiko as trans, others claim that Yoshiko dressed as a man solely for military ambitions. However, I believe that attempting to box Yoshiko into any of these gender categories takes away from the most interesting aspect of Yoshiko's life. In this video, we're going to explore how Yoshiko's relationship with their gender was shaped by the militaristic ambitions driven into them. Before we start this video, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Now, let's go on to the video. In the article Post-Colonial Historiography of Queer History, Howard Chang argues that even though queer historians acknowledge that gender and sexuality are social constructs, they often use those same restricting constructs to define queer history as a whole. Many historians tend to write about people of the past using the standards of the present, even though social norms are regionally and periodically based. Today in the West, we tend to associate queerness with progressive politics, but this is not always the case, especially when it came to the gender-fluid, pro-dynastic Japanese collaborator Yoshiko Kawashima. For the purpose of this video, I will be using the gender-neutral pronoun they in order to refer to Yoshiko because their gender is complicated and changes throughout their life. In this video, I will be pulling most of my information from the biography written by Phyllis Birnbaum. While I did disagree with some of the portrayals of Yoshiko in the book, Phyllis used a lot of primary sources that greatly helped me write this video. So big shout out to Phyllis, go read that book. It's really good if you want more in-depth analysis of Yoshiko's life. Psychoanalysts say that childhood shapes your psyche, and if we were to adopt this approach, boy oh boy are they a complicated individual. Yoshiko was born into the Aisan Gyoro clan of the Qing dynasty. The Qing were the last imperial family of China, but they were not ethnically Han Chinese. Instead, the Qing were founded by the Manchus, an ethnic minority that were native to the province of Manchuria in northeast China. Because the Qing were essentially a minority ruling over the majority, coupled with the weakening of their empire in the 20th century, they were inevitably overthrown in the Xinhai Revolution of 1911. Yoshiko was born in the midst of this political upheaval to the Qing prince Shanqi. We don't know much about Kawashima's life under Shanqi, but he was a key figure in how their upbringing would play out. While he was not a direct heir to the throne, he had an obsession with the restoration of the Qing dynasty, so he moved to Port Arthur in hopes of collaborating with the Japanese army there to create an independent Manchurian state and re-establish the Qing. Shanqi was not the best father to Yoshiko, because his obsession with restoring the Qing consumed his everyday life. Not to mention, Yoshiko was one of the 38 children he had, so naturally they were neglected, middle child syndrome and all. All of a sudden, at just 7 years old, Yoshiko was ripped away from their own family by their own father. Shanqi gave them away to his comrade in Japan, Kawashima Naniwa, who was childless and a valuable political ally for this obscure plot. At just 8 years old, Yoshiko went from living in China to living in Japan, which were two completely different cultures with stark moral and cultural differences. Yoshiko recollects this tough transition in an interview they did later on. They took away my Chinese clothes and dressed me in a Chinese crepe robe and a long vest. My hair was cut short into a Japanese style, with bangs in the front. In those days, the Japanese called the Chinese C-word, and so I didn't have anyone to play with. And they were right. In Japanese schools and the public, Yoshiko recalls experiencing discrimination for being Chinese, and was forced to assimilate into Japanese culture in order to be accepted. Their national identity at home, however, was a very different story. Like Shanchi, Kawashima Naniwa was a political extremist who had similar goals. Phyllis describes Naniwa as a Tairuku Ronin, which is a Japanese word for foreign wandering men who made fixing China the center of their lives. I think we can understand why he and Shanchi were comrades. Anyways, Naniwa had this crazy plan to create a joint independent state for the Manchurians and the Mongolians, who also wanted independence following the Xinhai Revolution. Dinner table discussions in the Naniwa household were always about Manchurian independence, and there was always some sort of ultra-nationalist or military personnel staying in their home. Even when Yoshiko was failing out of school in their later years, Naniwa did not seem to care because it didn't affect their political ambitions for Yoshiko. This indoctrination was made apparent when one of their former classmates recalls Yoshiko saying that with a few thousand troops, they could take over China, which is a very, very bold statement from the young Yoshiko. Clearly, Naniwa was a key figure in shaping their belief system. Furthermore, because Naniwa and his wife were not on good terms, Yoshiko never had a constant maternal figure in their lives. Aside from the private tutor, Naniwa was Yoshiko's sole guardian, and he acted more as a political advisor to them than a father. He made sure to instill in Yoshiko a samurai mentality that emphasized the duty to the nation of Manchuria, and to be this courageous saving force to the Manchu people. From a young age, Naniwa influenced the impressionable Yoshiko and sought to create a future political leader out of them. What I found interesting is that these values are directly associated with masculinity in the Japanese Empire. Since the Meiji era in 1868, Japanese society emphasized that fighting for imperial expansion was the duty of men, and that raising the children who were to become the future men was the duty of women. This dichotomy was essential to forming the statehood of the Japanese Empire, and it was reinforced in schools and politics. So you guys may be asking, why fulfill these ambitions through Yoshiko? Yoshiko was assigned female at birth, and Shanchi had 38 children, many whomst were boys, so wouldn't it be more likely that a patriarchal figure such as Naniwa would desire a boy to fulfill his political goals? Interestingly enough, Naniwa attempted to raise Yoshiko as a man for these political ambitions. According to Chizuru Saiki, quote, "In hope that she would become a strong leader in Asia, Kawashima gave her a boy's name, Yoshio, but later changed it to Yoshiko in view of what others in his neighborhood might feel." This is a fascinating glimpse into the environment in which Yoshiko was raised. Don't get me wrong, I don't think Naniwa was a gender abolitionist or anything, especially considering the transphobic remarks he makes later in the story, but it shows that in their early years, Yoshiko was never really pressured into following female gender norms. In fact, visitors of the Naniwa residence would often describe them as a strong-headed, rebellious tomboy. Female classmates of Yoshiko recalled that they would use a traditionally male way of speaking Japanese. According to Cameron Lombardo, otoko kotoba, or men's language, is described as a linguistic resource that men use to assert their masculinity when times are needed. Lombardo emphasizes that since Japanese society values politeness overall, the usage of this male language technique is not common unless somebody was trying to deliberately sound gruff. This also lends us some insight into the heavy masculinized environment in which Yoshiko was raised in. Some historians claim that Yoshiko's grapples with gender was solely a product of their upbringing, because Naniwa instilled this masculine mentality into Yoshiko, and that led to gender confusion later on in their life. But this is a reductionist approach that lacks nuance. Firstly, Naniwa stated that they were, quote, "blessed by nature with both male and female aspects," end quote. Secondly, Yoshiko stated that they, quote, "were born with what the doctors call a tendency towards the third sex," end quote. With this, it can be safely stated that Yoshiko's gender was fluid from birth, and I would argue that Naniwa simply took advantage of this fluidity and raised them in a masculine way. I'll ask you guys again, Why else would Yoshiko's biological father give a biological girl to the childless Naniwa? I believe it's due to Yoshiko's gender fluidity that Shanchi chose to give them away specifically. Yoshiko was moldable. Their femininity could be used for a political marriage, and their masculinity could be used for military ambitions. They were the perfect candidate in this obscure political plot. When Yoshiko's biological father, Prince Shanchi, died in 1922, they had to return to China to attend his funeral. This was a turning point in their life, as Yoshiko felt the need to take up their father's incomplete mission of Manchurian independence. However, upon returning to Japan to continue their studies, Yoshiko was promptly kicked out of their school because of supposed illegitimate registration. But Yoshiko still needed an education from someone, so Naniwa decided to take matters into his own hands and privately tutor them for a period of time. For the free-spirited teenager, Naniwa's tutorage was infuriating to say the least. Now, not only was he their sole guardian, but he became their teacher as well. Considering Confucianist hierarchical values, Naniwa now had control of nearly every aspect of their lives. Diary entries and letters reveal that this was a period in which Yoshiko endured a lot of psychological trauma. So for the next part of this video, I am going to issue another content warning for talks of abuse, sexual assault, and self-harm. So jump to this timestamp if you would not like to hear about that right now. In a series of letters written between Yoshiko and their private tutor, they detail the abuse and shelter that they had to endure under Naniwa. Quote, "I was hit today too. I just serve as an outlet for his anger. When he gets angry at others, he has gotten into the habit of hitting me." Feeling isolated and alone in their own home, Yoshiko began to question why their father gave them up in the first place. Why they were the one who had to go to Naniwa instead of the 37 other children. Quote, "I'm a sacrifice, as I told you the other day. Did you understand? I'm the sacrifice of Prince Su's whole family. I have come here as your substitute, for the sake of my younger brothers." End quote. Primary sources also heavily indicate that Yoshiko was sexually abused by Naniwa. Furthermore, because Yoshiko was trapped in the confines of their home for so long, they often came in contact with Naniwa's male comrades who attempted to pursue them romantically. Moriyama Eiji was an ultra-nationalist who attempted to save Yoshiko from their father's abuse, but they did not care for them in the slightest. Unable to accept rejection, Eiji went to the press with an embellished and dramatized account of what happened. Next came Iwata Ainsuke, who was also an ultranationalist assassin who fell deeply in love with Yoshiko. But Yoshiko rejected them and said that they would rather be dead than be with Ainsuke. They literally attempted suicide at the very proposal. Yamaga Toru, on the other hand, was a lieutenant who developed a close mutual friendship with Yoshiko. But after the press began to spread rumors about their relationship, Yamaga had to publicly deny this relationship, calling Yoshiko an unordinary woman, which left Yoshiko feeling humiliated, of course. Now, not only was Yoshiko trapped in their own home, but the press would not stop harassing them about their sexuality and romantic life. It was around this time that Yoshiko famously said, quote, "I've had all this trouble because I am a woman," end quote, and decided to, quote, "cease being a woman forever." In a 1925 publication of Asahi, Yoshiko renounced their womanhood entirely, and appeared with a harsh buzz cut and their brother's university uniform. Some biographers attempt to attribute this sudden change to the modern girl phenomenon that was sweeping Japan. These were women who, after World War I, cropped their hair, discarded their kimonos, and adopted a Western flapper-like style. Instead of conforming to traditional gender norms and safeguarding their sexuality, these girls attended dance halls, flirted openly, and partook in many other gender taboos. While this movement may have given Yoshiko the freedom to express their gender, I certainly would not classify them as a modern girl. They wanted to break away from this label, not make it more apparent. What's interesting is that Yoshiko even denounced the modern girl movement later on in their career. I believe that the most important distinction between the two, however, are their clashing attitudes regarding politics and nationalism. Following the First World War, modern girls expressed political apathy. However, Yoshiko was a staunch Manchurian nationalist who adopted a militaristic masculinity. I mean, this was a self-proclaimed Joan of Arc of the East. However, we'll soon come to learn how this label became their very downfall. How their romantic idealization of liberating Asia fell right into the hands of the Japanese Imperial Army. So for context, let's talk a little bit about Japanese imperialism in the early 20th century. Imperialism as a whole is a phenomenon that needs a rigid ideological justification for it to be successful. The government needs to manufacture a reason to conquer another state, not only to meet international standards, but to meet domestic standards. They need support of their own population. Imperialists don't want to look like the bad guys. They want to be the saviors, the liberators. Japan's leading justification for their imperialist exploits was the slogan of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The Japanese Empire claimed that they would save East Asia from the Western expansion, because, if you didn't know, the 19th and 20th centuries was a period in which European powers set up several unequal treaties and colonized many East Asian countries from China to Vietnam. They claimed that they would liberate their Asian neighbors, but in reality, the Japanese had their own imperialist motivations. Oftentimes, the imperialist state will impose militaristic gender roles on their own population as a means of mobilizing support. Domestically, Japan was a society with historically rigid gender roles, so what better way to gain military support than to claim that imperialism was a masculine duty? That sacrificing your life for the state was the duty of Japanese men. The government constructed gender expectations for men to help justify their conquest and mobilize their population. From the 1868 Meiji Restoration to the end of World War II in 1947, Japan was a vast colonial empire known for its xenophobia, militant brutality, and subjugation. However, through propagandizing techniques such as this militant masculinity, they were able to get away with a lot of their atrocities. When it came down to it, they were able to manipulate people like Yoshiko into doing their dirty work. Back to Yoshiko, when they made this gender change, this angered Naniwa, who forced Yoshiko into political marriage with the Mongolian elite. This is once again an example of using the femininity of Yoshiko, but they despised the subservient role that they were expected to follow as a wife. So they fled the marriage and spent the following years traveling between China and Japan. In Shanghai, their sexuality was exploited once again by the press, despite their gender change. Because of their status as a Qing elite, the press heavily reported on their activities. Magazines would call Yoshiko a whore for attending dance halls, and they scrutinized their every activity. During this time, Yoshiko felt dehumanized, which led them to say, quote, "From the bottom of my heart, I feel jealous of those ordinary, gentle housewives who see their husbands off to work in the morning and are eager to receive them home in the evening. So if I get the right opportunity, I'll really make a complete return to being a woman." End quote. It was during this vulnerable state that the Japanese propaganda machine lured Yoshiko in. Sick of being seen as this overly sexualized celebrity figure, this could be the chance for Yoshiko to finally carry out their father's wishes and save Asia. This could be a way of asserting their masculinity. In a way, the Japanese weaponized Yoshiko's nationalism and gender queerness as a means of pursuing their imperial conquest. In 1931, the Japanese Imperial Army bombed their own South Manchurian railway because they wanted a reason to declare war on China. They pinned the blame on supposed anti-Japanese activists in the area, giving them a pretext for launching a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. But occupation would obviously garner popular disapproval, so the Japanese needed a Chinese figurehead that they could control behind the scenes. So they lured the deposed king elite into their plot to create a puppet state out of the region of Manchuria. Lieutenant Colonel Ishawara Kanji famously stated, Quote, Manchuria and Mongolia are not territories of China. They belong to the people of Manchuria and Mongolia. They offered the deposed King Emperor and his family a chance to reclaim their throne, with Japanese supervision, of course. In order to enact this plot, they turned to the vulnerable Yoshiko for military assistance. This was the opportunity of a lifetime for them. Finally, they had a chance at military prestige, a chance to have a say in their national identity, which in turn would affirm their gender identity. After all the efforts of Shanchi and Aniwa, the Japanese were the ones who would finally fulfill Yoshiko's destiny. Or so it had seemed. Later on in their lives, Yoshiko and their cousin Emperor Puyi would have recalled that they were tricked into working with the Japanese. Emperor Puyi was the last remaining emperor of the Qing dynasty. When it was overthrown in 1911, he escaped to Beijing, where he stayed in a few years in exile. However, as the Chinese Nationalist Party gained more power in the 20s and 30s, Emperor Puyi's existence became an increasing threat to their political ambitions. A lurking emperor could easily claim legitimacy and declare himself the rightful ruler, so Puyi had to be rid of. The Japanese saw this vulnerability and offered the emperor refuge in Manchuria, but this was not done out of the goodness of their hearts. You see, Japan needed its new territory to have the illusion of sovereignty. They needed a puppet leader, and who was better for this role than the deposed Qing emperor himself? In Puyi's autobiography, he claims that he was dumbfounded and helpless at the brutality of the Japanese. Was he really, though? It seems like a pretty convenient perspective, given the eventual loss of the Japanese. Yoshiko's allegiances, on the other hand, are a bit harder to pinpoint. One of Yoshiko's first tasks for the Japanese army is a contested story that is heavily mythologized. Muramatsu Shofu, who created a fictional story based on Yoshiko's life, made up this exaggerated, heroic account of what actually took place, and many people ended up accepting it as fact. In this tale, Yoshiko is characterized as a cool-headed spy who snuck the Empress and her dog in the trunk of their Cuban car. In this car, they sped by whizzing bullets all the way to the docks, with only a pillar of light to guide them. When they finally reached their destination, the Empress was filled with gratitude and gave Yoshiko an heirloom to honor them for this feat. Needless to say, it is a heavily dramatized account of what actually happened, but Yoshiko was very pleased with this heroic portrayal of their character, and subsequently adopted this fictional story into the autobiography they wrote later in their life. Their next known whereabouts were in Shanghai, where Yoshiko grew close with Ryukichi Tanaka, a member of the Japanese Imperial Army. It was because of Tanaka that Yoshiko garnered the spy master reputation. The two were living and working together in the early 1930s, when the Japanese Imperial Army was up to no good in Manchuria. While some speculate that they had a mutual romantic relationship, certain accounts lead me to believe that Tanaka was using Yoshiko as a means of achieving political ambitions, similar to how Naniwa and Shanchi did. When referring to Yoshiko, Tanaka-san later claims that his father, quote, understood her personality and made use of her for his work, realizing that she would be good at gathering information, end quote. And when he was tried for his crimes later on in his life, Tanaka admitted that he orchestrated the Shanghai incident. This was a violent conflict between the Japanese and the Chinese in Shanghai, January 28, 1932. Tanaka claims to have orchestrated this event in order to divert attention from the puppet state they were creating in Manchuria. According to Tanaka, Yoshiko was ordered to provoke Chinese workers into harassing Japanese monks and starting a violent altercation. To back this up, Yoshiko's brother also implied that Yoshiko participated in the Shanghai incident. According to Tanaka, Yoshiko was an invaluable asset to the Japanese cause, providing them with military intel on Japanese artillery and strategy. Unfortunately, however, we don't have any other sources verifying many of these actions. However, it is not entirely out of character for Yoshiko to have done this if it meant restoring the Qing dynasty and revamping their reputation. Whether or not they were involved in this incident, the press stopped harassing them about their sexuality and began treating Yoshiko with far more respect after the Shanghai incident. To take a closer look at this portrayal, I searched the Japan Times archives and found a lot of newspapers in the 1930s that glamorized and romanticized Yoshiko's military exploits. But it wasn't just newspapers covering Yoshiko this way. As I mentioned before, the novelist Muramatsu Shofu was inspired by their life and wrote a semi-biographical story about Yoshiko called The Beauty in Men's Clothing. This further added to the mythology of Yoshiko as a Manchu spy master, which certainly would not hurt the goals of the Japanese in Manchuria. Anyways, working with the Japanese army was not all sunshine and rainbows. Tanaka began to despise Yoshiko because he claimed that the fame had gotten to their head. Reportedly, they, quote, abused him with a foul tongue, attempted to sabotage his career, and abused the finances of the Imperial army. However, it is worth noting that around the time of their split, Yoshiko was a vocal critic of the Imperial army. They said, quote, I do not like what they do in Manchu, which is the puppet state in Manchuria. I tell them so, but they will not shoot me yet, I think. After living and working with the Japanese Imperial Army in Manchu, Yoshiko began to realize the intentions of the Japanese, the intentions that weren't so pure. The reason for their split is multifaceted, but after it happened, Yoshiko did not stop on their military ventures, because they were also strapped for cash. Thus, they left the shadows and took on an official military post as Commander Jin de Hui. They proudly donned a Japanese military uniform and were tasked with the suppression of banditry in Manchuria, which in reality were just uprisings against the advancing Japanese military into Chinese land. It was met with heavy skepticism, because Yoshiko had no military experience. So the press reassured their readers by creating yet another mysticized portrayal of Yoshiko's military feats. In this tale, Yoshiko reportedly floated down to the warlords' camp themselves with a parachute to negotiate the release of the hostages. But I must add that even Yoshiko themselves disputed this portrayal. After working both in the shadows and as an official military commander for the Japanese Imperial Army, Yoshiko became increasingly disillusioned with the promises that were made, the promises of Manchurian independence and the restoration of the Qing. For the first time, they witnessed firsthand the abuse of the Japanese military on the Manchurian government and their people. When The Beauty in Men's Clothing was officially published and Yoshiko returned to Japan, they were at the height of their fame. Yoshiko used their newfound status to express the atrocities that they witnessed. They told the Japanese people that the Chinese, quote, are suffering in hell compared to what your Japan is going through, end quote. And they were right, because the Manchurian people began to starve because the grain production in the region was shipped to Japan as their military strength declined. Not only was the imperial court forbidden from worshipping their king ancestors, they also beat Manchu soldiers who were not worshipping Japanese spirits. The people of Manchuria didn't even have yarn to make themselves socks. As Yoshiko said, quote, the Japanese go around spouting all kinds of noble slogans, but the fact of the matter is, Manchukuo is like a Japanese colony. When it came down to it, Yoshiko was right. Manchukuo was still controlled by the Japanese, and the Manchurian people had no say in its actions. They had been used as a pawn in their imperialist game. In 1933, Yoshiko made a speech in their hometown of Matsumoto, Japan, during which they discarded their Japanese military uniform and instead wore a traditional men's Chinese cap and robe. In the speech, Yoshiko spouted for peace and called for Sino-Japanese unity because they were brothers in the end. While the speech did not entail a cohesive plan to make this all possible, Yoshiko was able to express the shame, shock, and disillusionment that they felt after being discharged. Because of this vocal activism, Yoshiko was no longer the best PR figure for the Japanese Imperial Army, and they had no use for the Qing princess anymore. It is important to note that Yoshiko was still a contradictory figure when it came down to the fate of Manchuria during this time. Did Yoshiko finally see Manchukuo for what it really was? A colonial puppet state whose only purpose was to aid the Japanese Empire? Did Yoshiko not lay out a cohesive plan in fear of execution by the Japanese? We can't really know their true motivations considering the prominent position that they were in. When the Sino-Japanese War finally broke out in 1937, Yoshiko was given a job managing a small restaurant in Tianjin. This job was given to them by one of their mentors, who sought out to divert attention from their criticisms of the war. The Japanese Imperial Army no longer needed Yoshiko as a propaganda symbol, because number one, they had already invaded Manchuria, and number two, Yoshiko's condemnation of war would tarnish their validity. As a response to this, the Imperial Army marked Yoshiko as a security risk, and restricted their travel by keeping them to the Japanese city of Fukuoka. However, Yoshiko never lost their character. They were still ambitious and passionate about the Manchurian people. Because they finally realized the Japanese army's malicious intentions, Yoshiko's new goal was to broker peace between the two warring countries. They even planned on meeting with the leader of the Chinese nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek, to form political ties. What's interesting is that even though their military career came to an end, they did not revert to traditional womanhood like they said they would so many times. Yoshiko still proudly donned male Chinese garments and kept their hair short. This is further proven by the account of Yamagachi Yoshiko, who was Kawashima Yoshiko's close female companion at the time. She stated, quote, "This was a strange kind of beauty, her masculine charm drawing people in." They were close female companions. Close female companions. Anyways, Yoshiko's loyalty to the Manchu people never diminished, even the last stretch of the war. I mean, how could it? After witnessing the deceptive role of the Japanese, this strong-headed figure was not going to simply back down. When travel restrictions finally eased, Yoshiko established their permanent residence back in Beijing, the town in which they were born. Everyone around them told them that this was a mistake, that Japan was going to eventually lose, and Yoshiko would immediately be killed for their collaborative role. But the unflinching Yoshiko believed that their loyalties to the Manchurian people would absolve them in the end. Clearly, Yoshiko's plans to meet up with Chiang Kai-shek never happened, because this is very, very unrealistic. After Japan surrendered, Yoshiko was arrested by the nationalist government on October 11, 1945, because of their wartime collaborations, efforts to restore the Qing, and most criminally, their mannish appearance. Yoshiko was tried, but their defeat was inevitable. Remember, Yoshiko loved the limelight, and their exaggerated military adventures did not help their case. Remember, because of their father's political grooming, Yoshiko wanted to be remembered as this romanticized freedom fighter figure. Imperial Japan co-opted these ambitions by telling exaggerated fictional accounts of their life in order to advance their own propaganda efforts. Their identity and ambitions were co-opted by countries who were vying for power, and in the end, their extensive press coverage came to stab them in the back, and they were sentenced to death for aiding the enemy. But Yoshiko, despite the sentence, remained hopeful, thinking that if they were able to prove their Japanese citizenship, they would be acquitted of the charges because the charges were specifically them being a Chinese traitor. In order to go through with this plot, Yoshiko pleaded to Naniwa to falsify a Japanese citizenship document. But Naniwa not only declined, but also went as far to tell the nationalists that Yoshiko lied in their testimony. It became clear that Naniwa never cared for Yoshiko. He just saw them as a political tool. In one of their last recorded poems, Yoshiko stated, quote, "Go with a smile. That is the proper way. I am my father's daughter." End quote. They died March 24th, 1948, at the age of 40. As we can see, Yoshiko did not simply break gender roles by dressing masculinely and participating in these activities. In fact, their motivations were not feminist at all. Yoshiko was simply a gender-fluid individual whose fluctuating identity was convenient for the political motivations of others. It is very interesting how their political ambitions can be interpreted as a means of asserting their masculinity in a culture that emphasized militant men. The story of Yoshiko further exemplifies how queerness does not always align with progressive morale. While Yoshiko did turn on the Japanese in the end, we still have to remember that they sought to uphold this reactionary Qing dynasty, a naturally conservative structure that sought to uphold this hierarchy. Regardless of what you think about Yoshiko, whether they were a liberating figure or a traitor to the Chinese people, I think we can all agree that they were a complex figure. Their upbringing, status, and people they encountered certainly shaped the person who they became. They cannot be understood in a vacuum, and this goes for queer history as a whole. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. It took a really long time to make, so I would appreciate it if you left a thumbs up, and if you disagree with me, if anything, leave it in the comments below. We can chat. And by the way, thank you guys so much for 29,000 subscribers and like 330k views on my Hikikomori video. That is absolutely absurd. I would never expect it. Thank you guys. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next video. Stay tuned. Bye bye.